For over 1,000 years, Rome stood as one of history's most enduring civilizations. At its height, the Roman Empire stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, governing an estimated 50 to 70 million people. Yet by the 5th century, the western half of this empire had fragmented into successor kingdoms. Understanding why requires looking beyond dramatic narratives of barbarian invasions to examine the gradual erosion of systems that had sustained Rome for centuries. The story of Roman decline is not one of sudden catastrophe, but of accumulated pressures on institutions that had grown too rigid to adapt. Historians increasingly recognize that Rome's fall resulted from interconnected structural problems developing over generations. Rather than any single cause or moment of collapse, one fundamental challenge was economic sustainability. Rome's expansion had been fueled by conquest, which brought wealth, slaves, and tribute into the imperial system. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, however, territorial growth had largely ceased. The empire now faced the costs of maintaining extensive borders without the influx of resources that expansion had provided. Military expenses consumed an estimated 70 to 80% of imperial revenue. Creating chronic fiscal strain to meet these costs, emperors repeatedly debased the currency, reducing the silver content of coins. The Antoninianist, introduced in the 3rd century, eventually contained less than 5% silver. This triggered inflation that destabilized markets and eroded confidence in imperial currency. Archaeological evidence from trade networks shows declining commercial activity in many regions during this period, suggesting economic contraction rather than growth. Agricultural systems also showed signs of stress. Roman prosperity depended heavily on grain production, particularly from North Africa and Egypt. Research indicates that soil exhaustion and deforestation reduced yields in some areas over time. Climate studies suggest that the Roman climate optimum, period of favorable conditions, began giving way to cooler and more variable weather by the 3rd century. While populations could often adapt to such changes, the rigid tax and supply systems of the late empire allowed little flexibility for regional variations in harvest. The administrative apparatus itself became increasingly complex and expensive. The late Roman bureaucracy employed tens of thousands of officials to manage taxation, supply chains, and provincial governance. This system, while impressively organized, required constant funding. As economic productivity stagnated or declined in various regions, the burden of supporting this administration fell more heavily on remaining taxpayers. Evidence from rural areas suggests that many small farmers struggled under tax pressure and increasingly sought protection from wealthy landowners, binding themselves in dependent relationships. This concentration of land and power in fewer hands weakened the traditional base of civic participation and military recruitment. The Roman army, once drawn primarily from citizens and Italian allies, came to rely more heavily on recruits from frontier regions and peoples outside traditional Roman society. Military challenges multiplied during the 3rd and 4th centuries. Rome faced pressure along multiple frontiers simultaneously. From Germanic peoples along the Rhine and Danube to the Sasanian Empire in the east. Maintaining adequate forces along these vast borders while also defending against internal usurpers strained both manpower and resources. The empire fragmented temporarily during the crisis of the 3rd century, though it was subsequently restored through massive military and administrative reforms. These reforms, undertaken by emperors like Diocletian and Constantine, stabilized the empire temporarily, but at significant cost. The army expanded, the bureaucracy grew, and the tax system became more rigorous. The empire was divided administratively into eastern and western halves for more efficient governance. Yet these measures addressed symptoms rather than underlying structural problems. The reformed empire remained dependent on systems that were increasingly difficult to sustain. Social cohesion also shifted over these centuries. The spread of Christianity transformed cultural and institutional landscapes. While this provided new forms of community and authority, it also created tensions with traditional Roman civic religion and altered the relationship between religious and political authority. The empire became officially Christian in the 4th century. But this religious transformation coincided with, rather than caused, political fragmentation. By the early 5th century, groups that Romans termed barbarians were settling within imperial territory in increasing numbers. Historians note that these migrations often resulted from pressures these peoples themselves faced, including climate shifts and conflicts in Central Asia. Rome attempted to manage these populations through treaties and military settlements, incorporating some groups as federated allies. This strategy had precedence in earlier Roman history, but the scale and frequency of such arrangements in the late empire reflected diminished capacity to enforce traditional border controls. The deposition of the last Western emperor in 476 is traditionally marked as the end of the Western Roman Empire. Yet this event was more symbolic than transformative. Imperial institutions had already fragmented into regional kingdoms, many ruled by military leaders of Germanic origin who nonetheless claimed Roman titles and maintained elements of Roman administration. In many areas, daily life continued with gradual, rather than sudden change. The Eastern Roman Empire, governed from Constantinople, survived these challenges and continued for another 1,000 years. This Eastern continuation suggests that Rome's Western collapse resulted from specific regional vulnerabilities rather than inherent flaws in Roman civilization itself. The wealthier, more urbanized East proved more resilient to the pressures that overwhelmed Western provinces. Modern scholarship emphasizes that Rome's decline cannot be attributed to moral decay, barbarian superiority, or any single catastrophic failure. Instead, evidence points to the gradual breakdown of interconnected systems under sustained pressure. Economic stagnation limited the resources available to maintain expensive military and administrative structures. Environmental and climatic factors affected agricultural productivity in key regions. Administrative complexity created rigidity when adaptability was needed. Social transformations altered the foundations of civic participation in military service. Rome's fall illustrates how even the most powerful civilizations remain vulnerable when multiple stresses accumulate over time, and institutional frameworks cannot adapt sufficiently to changing circumstances. The empire did not collapse overnight, nor was its end inevitable. Rather, it transformed gradually under pressures that its structures, designed for a different era, could not fully address. The story of Roman decline remains one of systems under strain, of adaptations that proved insufficient, and of a civilization that endured for centuries before fragmenting into the foundations of medieval Europe